Hello, wonderful students of St. James. We are going to be doing some Juliet analysis. I'm going to go through some quite deep ideas. This is probably not going to be the only Juliet video I do, but it's going to be the first one I do, so hope you enjoy it. Juliet, what's in her name? And I've actually used her own quotation where she speaks of what's in her name after understanding and coming to terms with the fact that Romeo is a Montague and therefore is her sworn enemy. But writers, particularly Shakespeare, use his names quite specifically to ensure that we get elements of symbolism and messages. Now, there are probably a myriad of ways that Juliet's name can be interpreted and used, but I'm going to give you two that can hopefully unlock some ideas for you and to further some of your analysis. My first is that it comes from the word juvenus, meaning youthful. And certainly one of the key features of Juliet is that she is 13, not yet 14, and is therefore deeply youthful. However, when we consider the prologue from Fair the Fatal Foys of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives, the innocence of Romeo and Juliet, and the fact that their love, unfortunately, is broken and dishevelled and broken and ruined due to the cruelty of the world surrounding them, in particular this meaningless kind of rift that has caused all of this decades-long feud, her youth comes even more into present. Furthermore, the death of Romeo and Juliet is what causes the rift to end, essentially, as Capulet and Montague decide that as a result of them both losing their very young children, they must come to an end of it. Juliet's youth is also something that makes us question some of her decisions, and her impulsiveness is certainly something that makes a lot of the decisions of the play somewhat questionable, but also drives the dramatic nature of the play. My next idea comes from this. Jove's child, which Jove is Jovis, and Jupiter, when considering this idea of a god, and it's the sky's father. Now, why I like this Jove's child one is the fact that it makes Juliet's identity being part of whose child she is, and again links this idea of a patriarchal world where a young woman's identity was somewhat tethered to her father, and then once she was married, indefinitely tethered to her husband. Juliet is a child in this play, okay? And even Capulet says that she's a child at the beginning when he does not want Paris to marry her instantly. However, Juliet's childlike nature also at times is questioned, as she actually has very mature, very intelligent, and very brave moments throughout the play. And particularly in Act 4, without any Romeo as he's banished, she seems to drive the purpose and a lot of the plot and action of the play. Her decision to go to the friar, her decision to take her life falsely, first of all by the poison, and even her death at the end, which is far more of an honourable death. Romans believe that the most honourable suicide would be one with stabbing, and interestingly enough, Juliet takes that, whilst Romeo takes on a slightly more feminine role when he decides to take poison, which would consider a much more feminine and passive manner in how to die. What I want us to do is to delve into the world of Elizabethan England. It's very interesting because we obviously discuss the significance of patriarchy, but one must not forget the fact that there was a queen at that time. It was Elizabethan England because Queen Elizabeth I was the monarch of that time. Now, this is from a very famous speech of hers, and she says, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Now, what is very telling about this speech is the description that she gives of women. And if we look at it, it's this description of women, and I'm just underlining it here, underlining it in yellow, so apologies. I'll try and underline it in red actually, of this idea of women being weak and feeble. And here is arguably the most powerful person in the world, but yet she's describing herself as weak and feeble. And definitely this is what tells us about how women were seen, and the very domesticated nature that we see Juliet in, we mainly see her in the Capulet household, is due to the fact that women then were seen as second-class citizens and seen as domesticated. What is fascinating here is that we have, as I keep saying, the most powerful person in the country being a woman, but yet she still understands or seems to kind of adhere to this idea that women are weak and feeble and certainly lesser than a man. When it comes to gender roles in text, and particularly with Shakespeare, we kind of see them come under like three different categories. So the bored, the kind of the woman who makes sometimes sexual jokes and is there for kind of comic relief, and I would argue that the nurse comes under that. These women were often older or not seen as desirable. The innocent. We would say that that is the innocent young girl. If you think about other Shakespearean plays, I would say a character like Ophelia, who doesn't do anything but due to her lack of status and her femininity, gets hurt and ultimately dies. And I would go for the femme fatale, so our Lady Macbeths, for instance, who do, and even to some case, you could argue Cleopatra and Antony and Cleopatra, all women who do things and use their intellect or use their sexuality and therefore have severe repercussions. Now, I'm going to ask you to pause for a second to think, which one does Juliet fit into? Would you argue she's the bored, the innocent, or the femme fatale? So she actually isn't any of these. She subverts all of this. She's not the board, obviously, because she isn't making these kind of brash, base, kind of quite vulgar sexual comments, or she's not speaking purely in prose. She's deeply quite intellectualized actually at certain points, even though she is 13. She's not purely the innocent. Yes, she is deeply innocent, particularly at the beginning. However, the innocent has things done to them rather than does anything. And we know that Juliet is a woman of action. Again, I'm going to remind you, particularly in Act 4, when she goes to see the friar, tell me not, friar, that thou hearest of this, unless thou tell me how I may prevent it. Here we see Juliet taking action. Again, I want you to remember that structurally, Romeo is not in any scene in Act 4 because he's banished. So therefore, Juliet almost takes the mantle of the tragic hero or heroine and takes on really pushing the action of the play. You could also argue that Juliet, obviously, as well, has this wonderful kind of almost Christ-like moment where she not only dies once but dies twice. First of all, the false death, where she takes on the role of dying in order to defy her familial expectations, in order not to marry Paris, in order not to have to listen to her father's orders. But then her second death, as I said, and particularly her stabbing with the "Oh happy dagger" speech, shows that she is not purely the innocent. She takes this and she takes on a very strong role. Always remember that the final words of the plays, never was there a story of more woe than of Juliet and her Romeo, showing that Juliet is arguably superseding and taking over Romeo as our key figure. And I definitely would not call her the femme fatale. She is considered quite innocent at the beginning, and the only sexual relationship she has is with her husband Romeo after they have been married. And we also don't see her being purely manipulative. Every action she does is in order to stay married to Romeo, who she now, if you would argue for Elizabethan times, would now be the person that she has to listen to and adhere to. And she cannot marry Paris because that would make her a bigamist, amongst other things. And if anything, to be able to be an honourable wife to Romeo. So Juliet is a phenomenal figure because she actually subverts any of these kind of archetypes or stereotypes of characters that we may see in Shakespeare's work. Now let's look at how Shakespeare shows this. First of all, it's through her use of language. I want you to notice her use of interrogative. What's in a name? Dost thou love me? There are several more, but I've chosen these two because what we see is Juliet driving the relationship between her and Romeo. She very much is the catalyst for Romeo going from our kind of love-spurned Petrarchan lover to a Shakespearean lover and a much more well-rounded and much more nuanced character. The second way she does this is through the use of sonnet form. Now, I've spoken about this in previous lessons, and I know other teachers have at St. James. But when we think about the idea of sonnet, we think about Petrarch, the Petrarchan lover. Petrarch, who wrote sonnets, deeply trying to show his love to a beautiful Italian nun who continuously spurned his advances. And Romeo, certainly at the beginning, is that Petrarchan lover due to the unrequited love that unfortunately Rosalind will not in any way reciprocate. However, Juliet uses the sonnet form. Typically, sonnets are written from men to women, and therefore the woman, while she may be the object of the sonnet form, does not have any voice in the sonnet. And here, Shakespeare subverts this expectation quite wonderfully, and I'm going to show you how in the next slide. Now, when Romeo and Juliet first meet in Act 1, Scene 5, their lines to each other forms a 14-line sonnet, which is rather lovely. What I've bolded here is Juliet's comments, because what you can see is that Juliet almost shares the equal amount as Romeo as to how much they both say. Juliet says, "Good pilgrim, if you do wrong your hand too much, which manly devotion shows in this, for saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm as holy palmers kiss." Now, what we have is Romeo, and he uses very religious language, again showing this idea of their love being, pure and, almost sanctified to some extent. And Juliet does not in any way decide to reciprocate that, but instead what she does, which is quite clever, is that she understands herself as being this heightened being and very much plays along with it. When considering the traditional role of a woman in the sonnet form, Juliet's reciprocation is subversive and rather controversial, because she is not purely the topic, that she's not purely the topic or the focus of the sonnet. She is herself speaking the sonnet form, showing her to be a much more complex and much more fascinating character than we may have first thought when we encountered a 13, not yet 14-year-old girl. Now, this is a little bit of analysis. It's not taken from me. It's from the Utah Shakespeare Festival, but I just absolutely loved it. And then we're going to look at the quotation in bold to end this video. It says, playful and actively involved in the pilgrim's encounter, Juliet next counters Romeo's Petrarchan hyperboles, meaning his overtopness, with practicality in the balcony scene. Her pointed questions, for example, when she asks him, by whose direction found thou out this place? Remember what I said, those use of interrogatives, are met with rhapsodic responses, by love that first did prompt me to inquire. So what we see here is that Romeo is this kind of hyperbolic Petrarchan lover, very much led by this overtly emotional state, whilst Juliet seems to be led by practicality, once again kind of defying what we may think of as a 13, not yet 14-year-old girl. Direction as she makes the marriage proposal that requires him to turn his Petrarchan rhapsodies into action. If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow. Discussing the numerous allusions to falconry in this play, Caroline E. Brown argues that Juliet plays the falconer in her taming the falcon Romeo by ridding him of his Petrarchanism. Okay, and I just love this idea that she is the one ridding him of any of this kind of overt, kind of hyperbolic silliness, and rather more, she makes him a man of action here. Send me word tomorrow. She is stating this. I have put as well the link to the website on here because there's some wonderful things there on Romeo and Juliet. So thank you to the Utah Shakespeare Festival. It was fantastic to read. Right, so this was the quotation I said we would look at, and this is Act 2, Scene 2, towards the end of the balcony scene. If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow. And I've already kind of spoken about the interrogatives and the fact that she is directing Romeo at this moment. But let's look even deeper. First thing I want us to use is the word if, which begins the actual sentence, and it's the use of conjunction. There's almost this sense of it being conditional to Juliet. If what you are saying is honourable, if, showing that Juliet is far more nuanced in her understanding of love. But also you can argue that there is much more of her questioning Romeo here. And rather than being purely kind of infatuated with Romeo, she is very much giving him a condition of, if you are honourable, then please let's get married. But if you are not, because the if suggests that she's questioning this, then please direct your feelings elsewhere. And this idea of direction is very much with that phrasing of bent of love. And I think that is just absolutely beautiful. The idea that love shapes us, it bends us. But it kind of suggests this idea of direction, that love could be directing you the right way or the wrong way. In many ways, Juliet is helping to guide or direct Romeo's intention to something far more tangible. And then she says, send me word tomorrow. And I want you to look at the verb send, okay? Again, she is making Romeo, rather than this young man who's pondering and using these hyperbolic kind of beautiful terms, she is making him a practical man that has to make action in order to have her as his wife. And she says send, and we have this beautiful use of verb. She's somewhat didactic in her role. She's instructing Romeo, again subverting Elizabethan ideas that women were merely to be passive. If anything, she is saying, I am not a passive person, and therefore you need to not be passive and simply tell me these beautiful things, but rather her practicality is what shines through. In fact, the entire sentence is an imperative commanding language. Send me word tomorrow. She's telling him, and she's challenging Romeo to be honourable and to ensure that their marriage actually happens. Hope you enjoy the video, and we'll get another Juliet video, but I think I'm going to do Romeo next.